We can date the modern era of Judaism from about 1500 up till the present. At the beginning of this era, the Jews still had serious difficulties in many places. In Christian Europe, the practice of ghettos was established by the Pope in the year 1555. These were areas in a city where the Jews were forced to live. It was to keep them all contained. They had a curfew and they had to be locked in at night. This Pope wrote, quote, "And it is completely absurd and improper in the utmost that Jews, who through their own fault were condemned by God to eternal servitude, can under the pretext that pious Christians must accept them and sustain their habitation, are so ungrateful to Christians as, instead of thanks for gracious treatment, they return contumely, and among themselves instead of the slavery which they deserve." End quote. That's from his statement Cum Nimis Absurdum, 1555. The practice of ghettos was only fully abolished in 1870. But in this era, the Jews' fortunes generally began to improve. First of all, they were welcomed back by most of the nations that had kicked them out. And in Europe, there was in general a lightening of legal and social restrictions, especially after the French Revolution in 1789. And this continued into the early 19th century. Further, in the modern era, in the 1600s through the 1800s, many Jews achieved prosperity in Europe, especially in the fields of banking and business. In Christianity and in Judaism, it had been considered a sin to lend money at interest, at least to people in your own group. But Christians wanted to borrow money. They weren't allowed to lend money at interest to other Christians, so they were glad to borrow from the Jews. The Jews, being outsiders, needed a good angle. They needed a way to get by, and they became the leading bankers in Europe, also proficient in trade and business. And after about the mid-1700s, Jewish culture became increasingly modern, increasingly integrated into the modern cultures of European societies. And there were, during this period, many conversions to Christianity. In the 1800s in Europe, alongside various nationalistic movements, there arose what came to be called Anti-Semitism. This term was coined by the journalist Wilhelm Marr, who died in 1907. Anti-Semitism was fueled by jealousy over the Jews' success, over their wealth, their influence, and their involvement in banking. There were some occasional minor pogroms against the Jews in the 19th century. Starting in the 1850s and going up through World War II, there was, quote, scientific racism at work here. The Jews were considered an inferior Asiatic race, a less evolved breed of people, and supposedly incapable of true integration with the more advanced peoples, which of course were the Europeans. This kind of anti-Semitism was to bear some horrible, ugly fruit later on, but it didn't start with the Nazis. It went back many decades in European societies in different countries. A big part of anti-Semitism, sadly continuing till the present day, is a certain conspiracy theory. It derives from a book called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which first appeared in Russia in 1903. The plot of this book, which is obviously fictional, is that Jewish leaders are conspiring to take over the world by secretly gaining control of all important institutions. This book was assigned to school children by the Nazis. Sadly, it was promoted in America by Henry Ford, the founder of the Ford Motor Company, and it's never gone out of print. In any case, it's obviously false. No serious historian believes it. It was obviously cooked up by someone who hated the Jews to try to frame the Jews for various problems in Europe at the time. If you want to read more about this sorry tale, you can look for the book The Lie That Wouldn't Die, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, written by Hassada ben Itto. Another thing that occurred towards the end of the 1800s was increased Jewish emigration. Jews were getting up and moving to somewhere they hoped would be better. Many of them emigrated to America, where they found new freedom and peace. Others went to Palestine and began to hope there could be a Jewish nation there again. In part, this was to escape anti-Semitism in Europe. This brings us to the Holocaust and World War II. World War II lasted from 1939 to 1945. It was begun by the aggressions of Adolf Hitler, who ruled in Germany from 1933 to 1945. His National Socialist Party was always anti-Semitic, always concerned with what they called the Jewish problem. They started World War II by invading other countries to expand their territory. At first, they persecuted and then kicked out and then imprisoned the Jews, but then things took a much worse turn in 1942. In 1942, Hitler's regime began building specially invented death camps in order to kill mass numbers of Jews and other people they hated, such as various Eastern Europeans, the mentally handicapped, other religious minorities, gypsies, and so on. This act of mass murder is now called the Holocaust. Holocaust means burnt offering. This murder came to be called the Holocaust because the Nazis actually invented special ovens to burn great numbers of bodies because it was too difficult to bury them all. Eventually, about 6 million Jews were killed by the Nazis and their collaborators in some of the countries that cooperated with them. Somewhere around 1/3 of the Jews in the world were wiped out. The Jews in Eastern Europe were the hardest hit. In many of those places, nearly all the Jews were killed. The Holocaust has played a huge role in the mindset of Jews in the 20th and 21st centuries, not to mention the rest of the world. When these death camps were discovered, with bodies stacked high and the living looking like walking skeletons, the people of the world were ashamed that they had let this happen. A few people did know about it. A lot of people kind of knew about it and didn't want to fully know about it. In any case, there was no ignoring it when the German armies were pushed back and these camps were liberated by the Americans and others. And many people in the world at this point decided that the Jews should have their own nation. This idea didn't begin after World War II. There was a Zionist movement begun in the late 19th century that's named after Zion, another name for Jerusalem. This movement argued that the Jews should have their own homeland. The problem was that Palestine had been part of the Turkish and Ottoman Empire and so was populated by Christian and Muslim Arabs. The Zionist movement was supported by a minority of Jews and also aided by a few sympathetic Christians who in many cases believed that a restoration of the state of Israel would be the fulfillment of a biblical prophecy. This Zionist cause was supported in particular by the British during and after World War I, when they were given control of Palestine by the League of Nations. In 1947, the General Assembly of the United Nations divided Palestine into Jewish and Arab homelands, and this led to total chaos. There is to this day much bitterness over this. The non-Jews who lost their land and property consider themselves refugees. In 1948, the British withdrew from the area, and modern Israel was born, or many would say reborn, after roughly 2,500 years. For conservative Jews, this was the hand of God. This was God restoring to the descendants of Abraham the land that God promised to Abraham so long ago. To the Arabs who lost land, this was just a theft. Israel fought a series of short wars with their Arab neighbors in 1948, 56, 67, and 73. The most important of these was the 1967 Six-Day War against Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. You can see on this map that modern Israel, as created in 1947 and 48, is in light yellow. But in the Six-Day War, they seized the areas that are in kind of peach color there. There's the west bank of the Jordan River, the Golan Heights, the little Gaza Strip there next to the Mediterranean, and the big Sinai Peninsula, which connects with Egypt. Also, some area was taken in Jerusalem. Jerusalem had been divided up into Jewish and non-Jewish areas. The Sinai Peninsula has since been given back, but these other areas are to some extent occupied. And there's been ongoing violence in the 1990s and in the 2000s, and the matter still isn't really resolved. There are a number of Muslim countries and people groups that would like to see Israel destroyed forever. Israel, though, has become a U.S. ally, and although they don't acknowledge it, they have developed nuclear weapons. And so as of now, they hold their enemies at bay. So that's our quick survey of the history of Judaism. In our next lecture, we'll survey some important Jewish groups and doctrines.